What's up guys, my name is Ace, and welcome back to the Versus series. This is the series where I take two similar elements from a Call of Duty game, I put them side by side, have a deep look at their stats to see which one is better. And for Warzone specifically, I've already done the M4A1 versus the Grau, because at the moment those are the two most used assault rifles in the game. However, those two assault rifles aren't actually super similar. One of them is more of the higher fire rate assault rifle, whereas the other one is more of a lower fire rate assault rifle. So now with this series, I wanted to start specializing a little bit and look at the guns that are really similar to each other. So in today's episode, we're going to be having a look at the Kilo 141 versus the Grau. Now these two assault rifles are very similar. They're designed to be the more lower fire rate, but super accurate assault rifles. And let's just start hopping into the basic stats. For rate of fire, the Kilo is a little bit faster at 779 rounds per minute, whereas with the Grau, it's 750 rounds per minute. So they're pretty close in this area, but yes, the Kilo is a little bit faster. It's worth noting that all of our damage values are identical between these two guns. However, since the Kilo has a faster fire rate, that means it also deals more damage per second, or it has a higher DPS value. With the Kilo, our DPS is 364, whereas with the Grau, it's 350. Taking that into our time to kill, assuming the enemy has no armor equipped whatsoever, the Kilo will kill in 231 milliseconds, whereas the Grau kills very slightly slower at 240 milliseconds. Realistically speaking, if you're playing on console for instance, this is less than a frame difference, and therefore you'd still be killing the enemy on the exact same frame with both the Kilo as well as the Grau, assuming they don't have armor. However, I also want to have a look at what it looks like when the enemy has full health and full armor. What is our time to kill in this situation? Well, there's no surprise here, the Kilo is still killing faster at this point. Our time to kill is 616 milliseconds, whereas with the Grau, it's 640 milliseconds. This is where it does start to become a little bit noticeable. So far, the Kilo definitely has a very slight edge over the Grau. But let's move on to the next set of important stats. The first one here is our aim down sight speed. With the Kilo, our aim down sight time is 250 milliseconds, whereas the Grau is actually a little bit faster at 243 milliseconds. Then taking a look at our reload time, they're pretty much the same in this area. Technically, the Kilo is just very slightly slower, but it's hardly even noticeable. And then finally, for our movement speed, this is actually a pretty huge difference. The Kilo has a movement speed of 93.5%, whereas the Grau is 96.5%. And this difference, like I said, is very noticeable, especially when you're looking at the Warzone map where you often have to cover fairly long distances. This is something that's immediately noticeable when you swap between these two guns. Now, as for all of our other basic stats like our hip fire, our sprint out time and everything, those are actually exactly the same with these two guns because that's pretty standard for assault rifles. But now I want to move into the range values, and this is where the Grau had a really significant advantage over the M4, especially when you started factoring barrels into the equation. So let's see how the Kilo stacks up. As you can see here, it's actually pretty close. The Kilo's 4-shot kill range is just a little bit lower than the Grau's 4-shot kill range. And then when it comes to the 5-shot kill range, yeah, the Grau does have a noticeably better 5-shot kill range here. So definitely the Grau is still king when it comes to range for the 5.56 assault rifles. But let's see what the barrels do to this. With the Kilo, we could use the Whisper barrel, which has an integrated suppressor, and that increases our ranges by 15%, which a lot of people didn't realize. Not a massive increase, but it is nice to know that it's there. Then our second barrel, the 16.6-inch barrel, this gives us a 30% increase to our ranges, which is great. But finally, we have the 19.8-inch barrel, which gives us a 45% boost to our range, which is huge, and that actually matches the percentage boost of the Archangel barrel on the Grau. So when it comes to Warzone, a lot of players are going to gravitate towards that 19.8-inch barrel just because it does give us such a nice boost to our range values. However, of course, the Grau is still king when it comes to this. That Archangel barrel gives you a ridiculous 5-shot kill range, and the Nexus barrel too, that also gives you a really nice boost. So while the Kilo does fare a lot better against the Grau here compared to something like the M4A1, it's still not quite there. The Grau gets the edge in this area. But next up, it's time to have a look at recoil. And I'm just going to throw up the side-by-side recoil plots right here with the different barrels that help with your recoil. And at first glance, you might be thinking, wow, the Kilo 141 has half the recoil of the Grau. There's barely any recoil at all when you look at the total magnitude of the recoil. However, something to be aware of on the Kilo 141 is it does veer pretty hard to the left, and this can be quite difficult for a lot of people to control. Most people are used to guns kicking upwards and to the right, and therefore when you get a left-leaning recoil pattern, a lot of that muscle memory of controlling recoil from the right, you have to retrain that in order to be accurate. And on top of that, if you just look at the overall horizontal deflection on the Kilo versus the Grau, it's a lot more horizontal deflection. So we kind of have to look at the pros and cons here. But for me, I actually prefer the recoil pattern on the Grau over the Kilo because vertical recoil is really easy to control. You basically just pull down on your right analog stick or pull down slightly on your mouse as you're firing, and you can control that recoil with very little thought or effort. Whereas the Kilo 141, while it is still insanely accurate, it's still one of the most accurate full auto guns in the game, it does require a little bit more effort and a little bit more thought to control that recoil, in my opinion. On top of that, though, you can, of course, see what the barrels do to this, and with the Kilo, honestly, it's not a huge difference with either of those barrels, whereas with the Grau, you definitely notice some more significant improvement to your recoil by using the barrels. So this one is a little bit tricky, and it does come down to preference to an extent. I personally prefer the recoil pattern on the Grau. However, for some people, they would prefer the recoil on the Kilo. But that pretty much covers it for the comparison of these guns without too many attachments included. Now let's start throwing attachments into the mix to see how they affect them, because in-game, of course we're going to be using attachments on this, so it is really important to look at that. Now the first comparison I want to look at is with the longest barrels that you can use on these guns. These are the most popular barrels that you'll see most people gravitate towards for Warzone because those fights tend to get spread out a little bit further than you'd see in multiplayer, and therefore you want to gain as much advantage as possible when it comes to range as well as recoil control. So with these, we get the exact same boost to our damage range as we saw earlier. This is a 45% boost, although the Grau has better base range, so you get better overall range while using the Archangel barrel compared to the longest barrel on the Kilo. Then when it comes to our aim down sight time, both of these slow our aim down sight time. However, the Archangel has a slightly worse effect on the Grau, and that actually equalizes their aim down sight time now, because if you remember, our base aim down sight time was a little slower on the Kilo. Now they're exactly the same with these barrels. And this leaves us with movement speed. With the Kilo, we lose 4% to our movement speed, which, as I said earlier, the Kilo is already kind of feeling slow against the Grau. When you pop this barrel on, it almost feels like an LMG. It is very, very slow, whereas the Grau doesn't have quite as much of a reduction to its movement speed with the Archangel barrel, and therefore this pretty much just brings our movement speed down to normal assault rifle levels, rather than taking it all the way down to what feels like an LMG when it comes to movement speed. At the same time, though, it is worth noting that a 3.5% reduction is still very noticeable. But moving on to the next thing I want to compare with these two barrels, these are the iron sights. This is very important within Warzone because you'll often see people not running an optic on the Grau with the Archangel barrel because it has such good iron sights, and that saves you a very valuable attachment slot that can be spent elsewhere. Whereas when we put that side by side with the Kilo 141 with its longest barrel, I really don't like that iron sight too much. Like, it's kind of usable, but not to the point where I feel comfortable challenging people at really long ranges without having an optic on this gun. And this means, with the Kilo, in the context of Warzone, I'm often gravitating towards using some form of an optic, whether that be a reflex sight or something higher zoom. I just don't really feel comfortable using iron sights when trying to challenge people at long ranges, which is what this gun is kind of designed to do. If I wanted to challenge people up close, I'd be using a higher fire rate assault rifle, or I'd be using an SMG. So that's a comparison of the longest barrels, and now finally, I just want to have a look at what you can do when you stack a bunch of attachments together, a bunch of the commonly used attachments on both of these guns, to see what that ends up doing to our recoil. So with this recoil plot, on both of these guns, I have the longest barrel, I've got the monolithic suppressor, I've got the tac laser, and I've got the commando foregrip. The other attachment I would tend to use with these would be a 60 round mag, but just for the purpose of this recoil test, it made more sense to have 30 rounds, so I just removed that magazine for this. But as you can see here, the Kilo is actually looking a lot better than its base recoil, and it's not veering nearly as much to the left. Now, it does lean a little to the left still, but it's not nearly as crazy as before, and therefore it becomes a lot more controllable at this point. Having said that though, I still love the recoil properties of the Grau. It kicks basically straight upwards, very little side-to-side sway, and it doesn't seem to lean heavily in either direction. So at this point, I strongly think this just comes down to preference. I'm perfectly happy with the recoil on both of these when you've got the right attachments. The one problem I wanted to circle back to with this though, is I often want to be using an optic on my Kilo, and therefore I have to sacrifice one of these attachments. And usually the first one to go for me is going to be the commando foregrip, and therefore my recoil properties aren't going to be as good. And that's one of the things that once again makes me lean a bit more towards the Grau. And that's going to wrap it up for the overall comparison of the stats of these guns. However, I also wanted to share with you guys some great attachment combinations that I like using within Warzone currently with both of these guns, for those of you guys that are looking sort of for that best setup, or at least best setup for me. So with the Kilo, I've got the monolithic suppressor, I've got that 19.8-inch barrel, I've got the tack laser, and the tack laser is great, mainly for that aiming stability and aim down sight time, which is very important, especially when you're running attachments like the monolithic suppressor and the longest barrel, which both pretty significantly increase your aim down sight time. Now on top of that, I also run a Solo Zero mini reflex. I really like using an optic on the Kilo, although I don't always run an optic. It is viable still with the iron sights. And therefore, for me, this is kind of interchangeable with a Commando foregrip. And that just leaves us with these 60-round mags, which is just kind of a given. I don't like the big 200-round drum mag. That just slows you down way too much in both aim down sight speed as well as movement speed. So I stick to the 60-round mags. As for my Grau setup, I have shared this before, but again, we've got that monolithic suppressor, the longest barrel, which is the Archangel barrel, the 60-round magazine, and the Commando foregrip. This is just the perfect combination that I have personally found for Warzone. I know some people don't like using the tack laser, and they might swap that out for the Void 2 grip, or maybe the no stock attachment, for instance. But the way this is set up right now, this is what works best for me. And with that, it's finally time to answer the question, which one of these two assault rifles is best? After playing around with both of these a decent amount and breaking down their stats, I've got to say, for me, it is clearly the Grau. There was a part of me that was really hoping I would find out that the Kilo is actually so much better than the Grau, and it's so underrated and everybody's using the wrong guns, so then I could kind of blow that up and let everybody know that the Kilo is better. But just looking at those numbers, the Grau is equal to or better than the Kilo in almost every single category. The only area where the Kilo does better is in rate of fire, and that difference in rate of fire isn't significant enough, in my opinion, to make the Kilo worth using over the Grau, if you're going for the best raw performance out of your gun. Now, to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying the Kilo is a bad gun. It's excellent. It's almost as good as the Grau, in my opinion. It's just a little notch under the Grau in my books. So I do encourage you to use the Kilo. I encourage you to try that out, and who knows, you might actually end up preferring that over the Grau. But when I'm looking at the facts and then combining that with my experiences with both of these guns, the Grau 5.56 is just superior. But of course, that is just my opinion and interpretation of these stats. I'd like to know in the comment section below, between these two guns, which one do you think is best? The Kilo 141 or the Grau 5.56? Also, if you guys are interested in checking out other episodes of the Versus series, like I said, for Warzone specifically, I've covered the M4A1 versus the Grau 5.56, as well as the MP7 versus the MP5. I will leave a link to that playlist in the description down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.